Welcome everybody, and thank you for being here tonight, whether you're here at the library or watching the live stream on YouTube. I'm Cheryl, one of the Adult Services librarians, and I want to let you know about several great programs coming up. On Monday, June 5th, we're partnering with the West Linn Garden Club for Berries, Secrets, and Success, where you can learn all about growing berries. And on Tuesday, June 27th, we have Family Trivia Night. We also have our summer reading program starting on June 15th, and it is open to all ages. You can find out more about all these programs by visiting our website at westlinnlibrary.org. I'm pleased to welcome Matt Reeder tonight. Matt is the author of Off the Beaten Trail, 50 Fantastic Unknown Hikes in Northwest Oregon and Southwest Washington, 101 Hikes in the Majestic Mount Jefferson Region, and PDX Hiking 365. His newest book, which he'll be talking about tonight, is Extraordinary Oregon, 125 Fantastic Hikes Across the State of Oregon. He lives in an old farmhouse in southeast Portland with his wife, Wendy. When not on the trail or in the classroom, he spends his free time obsessing about music, following the Portland Trailblazers, and reading voraciously. Please welcome Matt.
Hey, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you whether you're here in person or you're streaming. And it's a pleasure to be here. I've done a few of these presentations now, and it every time is a new experience, and every time I find myself looking through the slides and thinking, wow, we live in a really beautiful place. And that's what I'll be talking about primarily. So thank you, Cheryl, for introducing me. So I will be starting to click through my presentation. I have a lot of animations, so Cheryl, I'll try to give you a heads up. So who am I? For those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt, and I love hiking. So I guess I better stand right here. So when I was a kid, my mom and my stepdad, they got transferred from Central Illinois, where I was born, hence the Cardinals hat, from Central Illinois to Salem when I was 7. And I grew up in Oregon, and my stepdad, I think he really pushed for the transfer with my mom's job because I think he really wanted to explore the outdoors. And so by the time I was 9, I was hiking regularly. We lived in Salem, so I would go all over the Mount Jefferson region. And we would explore the Pacific Northwest a great deal. And when I was 16, we moved back to Illinois to help take care of both of my parents' families. But the outdoors here really stuck with me. It really stayed with me, and it was really something that I thought about a lot, even though I was happy to live in Illinois and to move back and live near my family. And so when I graduated from college, I was 24, it took quite a while, and I decided, well, I wanted to move back to Oregon, and the outdoors was a major reason why. So I moved back to Oregon and went to grad school here and got a master's degree in French, and I teach French as my day job. And I decided to write hiking guidebooks, thanks to the advice of my wonderful wife, who one day I was complaining about not finding the right kind of guidebook that I wanted for more obscure trails, and she said, just off the cuff, well, why don't you write one? And so I thought, you know what, maybe I should. I thought about it and I said, maybe I should. So over the course of a few years, starting in about 2010, I started working on a book called Off the Beaten Trail, which Off the Beaten Trail is a guidebook for obscure hikes. And I really wanted to focus on hikes that are not covered in other guidebooks. That's always been a fun thing for me. And it remains a fun thing for me to this day. I just love exploring obscure trails, old trails, abandoned trails. It's just a lot of fun for me. I am very proud of this book, and I put out a new edition in 2019, and that was the last time I was here, was to give a talk on the second edition of this. But with a lot of the changes that have happened over the last 5 or 6 years, the fires, a number of things have gone through land management changes where they're no longer accessible. That was one of my favorite hikes, and the second edition is now closed probably permanently, unfortunately. And just for, I can't be everywhere at once. I don't think I'm going to publish another edition of this book. At least if I do, it's going to be quite a while. But I'm still very proud of it. But as I mentioned, I also, there's the second edition cover with that lovely second edition button. But while I was promoting this book, right after I finished it, I was on a hike on the Klickitat River, I think not even a week and a half after I finished the first edition of this book, was on a hike with Wendy and another friend of ours, and I'd mentioned that I grew up in Salem. I wanted to go explore the Mount Jefferson region more. That's where we went a lot as a child. And my friend, and I cannot possibly do it justice, but essentially his response was, "I think you should write that book." And so I spent summers of 2014 and 2015 working on 101 hikes in the Majestic Mount Jefferson region, which to me, it was a deeply personal project. Having grown up in Salem, there were a lot of places I wanted to explore, but we just never really knew where to go. We had the Sullivan guidebooks, and those were great, but I mean, Sullivan guidebooks, those are an overview book. And, in his book for this region, he only has 10 hikes. So there were a lot of places that we just didn't know about. And so I decided to essentially write the book that I wanted to have when I was a kid. And it was incredibly stressful to finish it because it was like a cannonball run of 6 months of nonstop work. But I'm immensely proud of it. Unfortunately, many hikes in this book were damaged in the 2020 wildfires. And for those of you who were not here, there were 3 historic wildfires in this region alone, and many others in the state of Oregon that were incredibly damaging due to a massive windstorm that happened over Labor Day weekend that flamed these fires and basically burned a giant swath of land in this area and elsewhere in the region. So that's a lot of hikes were closed for 2020, 2021, 2022, and many of them are starting to reopen. I've even heard stories of rumblings of other things reopening that are not confirmed yet. But so I decided I think I am going to put out a new edition of this book, but it's going to be a while. And while I was working on this, I decided, the Mount Jefferson area mostly is accessible in the summer, in the fall. So most of the hikes I couldn't do in the winter. So my thought was, well, where do I go right now? And that was the subject of my guidebook that I decided to write, which ended up being called PDX Hiking 365, which was actually the first book I presented at the West Linn Library. So thank you for coming if you were here, and thank you, Cheryl, for inviting me. But the central premise of PDX Hiking is, what are the best hikes I can do right now? Not, August, when everything is open and beautiful, but right now. So if it's November, it's rainy out, I don't want to go very far from home, well, I'm not going up to the top of Mount Hood. I'm not going to Mount Jefferson, I'm not going to Mount Adams, I'm going to the Gorge, I'm going to Silver Falls. So that's the way this book is organized. And as with the Mount Jefferson book, some of the hikes were damaged in the 2020 fires, but most are still open. So I actually just released a new edition of this book 3 weeks ago. And I'm very happy with it, and I will be glad to talk about that at the end of the presentation if people would like. But you're here for my presentation about Extraordinary Oregon. So I published this book in late March. I have a superstition. I like to publish books the first day of spring. It's always been, I published Off the Beaten Trail the first day of spring, and so ever since then it's been kind of a superstition. But I also have an ulterior reason, which is that I am a community college professor, and that always happens during spring break. So I can promote it. But so Extraordinary Oregon I published this year, and it's the end result of 3 years worth of work. I started this book I started this book. I actually recently found my first draft of notes for this project, and it was dated May 29th, 2019. And so I thought, okay, so I was definitely thinking about it before the pandemic, and I know that I was. I've been thinking about doing a book on the whole state for quite a while, but I wasn't sure if I could pull it off. I thought, well, I don't know if I have the time for that, or I don't know if I wanted to commit myself to that. But then the pandemic happened. And because the pandemic happened, those early days of the pandemic, we didn't know where to go, if you were allowed to access things, what was open. And, that was obviously one of the least stressful aspects of that time period. But hiking really got me through the pandemic, as I'm sure it did for many of you. And the pandemic, of course, is not yet over, but it got me through the worst of the pandemic. And As summer 2020 rolled along, it became clear that, going outside is fine. I just didn't really want to travel and go to other states. And so I thought, well, now is the perfect time to work on this book that I want to do about the whole state of Oregon. I'll be staying in my home state. I do most of my research by myself. So for me, this was perfect. And over the course of the next 3 years, I just chipped away at it until I finished this book in September of last year. I finished the writing early this year, but I finished the research in September of last year. And so what the end result was 125 fantastic hikes across the state of Oregon. I couldn't just settle with 100. I tried. When you saw me, I tried. I was like, I can't cut this. I can't cut this. There are too many things I can't cut. So I want to present some of my favorite hikes. And so I have hikes across 9 regions of the state. I divided the state into 9 regions. And they are the Oregon Coast and Coast Range, which really is 2 regions in one. The Willamette Valley, the Northern Oregon, the Columbia River Gorge, the Northern Oregon Cascades, the Central Oregon Cascades, Southern Oregon, which is the Cascades and the Siskiyous, the Central Oregon High Desert, which is essentially everything in the center of the state, Northeast Oregon and Southeast Oregon. So I'll be presenting one hike from each of these regions. Starting with the coast. Part of me, I sometimes think I like to do things in a way that other people wouldn't think of them. So I actually considered writing this book east to west and starting with Southeast Oregon. I thought, no, that would be fun, but people would look at it and be like, no, this is stupid. So I decided against that. Thankfully, I did not even start work on that organization. So I thought, well, okay, even though it's the classic way to do it, I started at the coast. And so when we think of the coast, and Cheryl, I'm sorry, there's a lot of animation in these slides.
That's right.
When I think of the coast, we think of rocky headlands and waterfalls. And we think of green, verdant forests and waterfalls, lots of waterfalls. I won't be talking about this hike in my presentation, but this is Kentucky Falls. It's one of the really cool places way, way, way deep in the Coast Range, south between Eugene and Reedsport. And it's the only place I can think of on a trail where you can see 2 waterfalls falling side by side. Really, really a neat place, but also really kind of a bear to find unless you're coming from Reedsport, in which case it's easy. And of course, flowers, if you get there in season. This is a tiger lily, one of my favorite flowers. All my favorite flowers are lilies, for the most part. And so I'll talk about flowers some. More flowers. These are wild azaleas. I was not expecting to see them, but they grow fairly commonly along the southern coast near Brookings. And of course, more rocky headlands. I tried to cover as much terrain as I could and choose the absolute best hikes. And honestly, I could have written an entire book just on the coast and coast range. I cut a lot of hikes out of the end product, and I ended up not even doing some of the hikes that I really wanted to do. I think I chose wisely in the ones that I did do. But it's an immense region. The Oregon US 101 is 300-something miles along the coast, and every single square inch of beach is public property. So there's an immense amount of land that you can explore. But so I had to think about what's my favorite hike on the coast. And I'm not sure this is my favorite, but it was definitely the one that impressed me the most last year. And this is Blacklock Point, which is near the small but very charming town of Port Orford. So if you know the coast, it's between Bandon and Gold Beach and Brookings. So fairly far away from here. But these are the kind of things that when researching this book, I wouldn't go for like a day, I'd go for 4 or 5 days. And so a lot of this book process ends up making it perfect for like 4-day and 5-day getaways, vacations where you stay closer to home, etc. So Blacklock Point is really cool because you get to hike along the beach, along these really cool sandstone sea cliffs. And as you hike along, the cliffs get higher and higher. Eventually, you do have to leave the beach because the cliffs come into the beach here. And also you have to leave the beach because the tide comes in. And if you don't do this hike unless you've checked the tide table. Or rather, don't do the beach section of it. But this is one of the cool things too. There aren't that many places where you can see a waterfall falling directly onto the beach. And you can actually hike there if you catch the tide right. But so you get to hike along these sea cliffs, and that alone would make this a really cool hike. I mean, I fell in love with this before I even got to Blacklock Point. But then, you do have to leave the beach, and because and head towards Black Hawk Point, which is behind these cliffs. And then as you go along, you get closer and closer to the edge of this headland. And it might be difficult to see, but the flowers, I was there in June and the flowers were spectacular. This is a huge patch of native, It's a huge patch of native Oregon irises. So I was very impressed. And I got there on a really quite lovely day. And when I got close to Black Hawk Point, the view opens south to, this is Cape Blanco here, I think. Oh yeah, there's the lighthouse. This is Cape Blanco, which is Oregon's westernmost point. And so the view is really, really impressive. You got sea stacks, and down here you've got kind of like tide pools and more irises. I had really good luck while working on this book, getting like those perfect dewdrop flower photos that I just love. The reason for that is, of course, it rained an awful lot while I was doing research. But I got rained on a lot while I was working on this book. But so anyway, this is it's a lovely hike in any season, but I did this in June and the flowers were wonderful. And I'm a big fan of flowers, and I know many of you out there are as well, and I know several of you in this room are. So this is it was a really neat flower hike. But of course, the main point is to go out to Black Hawk Point, which this is the point, and it juts out into the ocean. And so you're on this kind of rocky headland. It looks terrifying, but actually the trail was not scary at all. It goes, and you don't even have to go this far. But there's a trail that goes right out to the top of that point right there. And I sat there and had essentially a very early lunch. It was like 10:30. And just looked up and down the coast and just loved every single minute of the choice that I'd made that day. This hike I wouldn't call this an easy hike. One thing about my book is I don't really believe in difficulty ratings because everybody's difficulty levels and skill levels are different. And even it depends on the day, and it depends on what shape you're in. Some days 10 miles might be easy, some days 10 miles might be the hardest thing you've ever done in your life. But so this is a 9.4 mile hike out and back. The elevation gain comes almost entirely leaving the cliffs and going up, there's a trail, and then going down to this headland and coming back up. And otherwise, it's pretty much a standard hike along the beach, then a walk through the forest. And I could not possibly say enough good things about this, and I can't wait to go back. Like I said, I could have written an entire book just on the coast, but I could have done an entire presentation just on the coast too. There's a lot of great things. But for now, we'll leave the coast. But one last note is that the Southern Oregon coast is the least talked about amazing place in the entire country. You have everything you could possibly want, including like tall peaks that are back in the backcountry there. It is truly a magnificent terrain, and it is not very well explored. And even along the beaches, not all the hikes, most of the beach hikes are not as crowded, or even close to as crowded as the ones closer to here. So we're going to leave the coast and come back home, talk about the Willamette Valley, where we live, I assume. For those of you, hello, on the streaming. I assume most of us live in the Willamette Valley, or all of us, but I can't be sure. So one of the difficulties I had with the Willamette Valley was there are so many great hikes in the valley, but this book is about fantastic and unique hikes in the valley, in the state. And many of the hikes in the Willamette Valley kind of feel similar to one another. So I only chose 6. This is the shortest section of my book, but the 6 that I chose I'm very happy with. So here's Powell Butte. This one, I would have chosen this anyway, but Powell Butte is walking distance from our house, so I kind of had to have at least one hike within walking distance of my house. And this is actually Powell Butte in the snow. That's the other time to explore the valley hikes is in the winter when you can't really get anywhere else. And so I really love to go to like Forest Park and Powell Butte when it snows. This is Silver Falls on a very, very wet and rainy day. Silver Falls is great in any season. I actually just went there yesterday. But my favorite times to go are in the fall and the winter. I'm not going to be presenting Silver Falls as my featured hike because it's Silver Falls, and I assume most people have heard of it. But it is, bar none, the best hike in the Willamette Valley. Well, I'm not going to make that proclamation about any other region, but this is the best hike in the Willamette Valley. But one of the other cool things is there are a lot of really neat like forest lanes through here. This is Mount Pisgah, just outside of Eugene. And I really, really loved exploring that area. I thought that was a really neat quasi-urban park. So there's a lot of cool things to explore in the valley. But I only chose to present 6 hikes because, again, I had trouble cutting so many others in other regions. And also I covered the Willamette Valley quite extensively in PDX Hiking as well. So the hike I am going to present is a really lovely place called Eagle Fern Park. Eagle Fern Park is not too far from the town of Estacada. And it is so named because, and I know that's a little bit difficult to see with the glare, but it's so named because Eagle Creek runs through the park and the ferns are massive. When you get there, and it's a very close drive from here. I actually drove by it last weekend and I was shocked at how little time it took again. But you get there and the beginning of the hike is a wooden suspension bridge. We have the best parks in Oregon. I know I'm biased, but we have the best parks. And as you hike along, right across the bridge, you enter into this world of massive trees. I like to come here in the winter, but it's great in any season. A friend of mine just went here with her partner and her partner's child, and their partner's child was so impressed with this hike. This child said, "We have to tell people about this," after going to Eagle Fern Park. That's the best compliment anybody's given me out of my book. But so as you hike along, and you get to go through the woods, and then there's a trail that goes up above the old growth area into the woods. And if you come here in the winter, which is what I usually do because it's a lot less crowded and it's close to home, I like to go on those sunny days where the fog is lifting and the sun pierces the fog. It really, truly is a beautiful thing to see, and it's one of those things that just never gets old. And the sun will pierce through and come through all of the moss and the ferns. You see the ferns right here. And there's my wife, Wendy. You'll see her a lot today. And you see yet more ferns. These are sword ferns, and they are everywhere at Eagle Fern Park. And then you get back to the creek. And the creek is a creek most of the year, but in the winter it really is basically a river. This is one of my favorite short hikes anywhere around because it's 1.7 miles with very mild uphill. It's very close to home. And yet you get to go over a suspension bridge, through the woods, through ancient forest, climb around giant ferns, and yet you can be home in time to make lunch. And that, you can't beat that. That's what makes this particularly great in the winter because, in the winter everybody's really busy. People are tired. It's cold. They want to go Christmas shopping or they want to cook dinner, and you can go, get up, do this, get home, turn on the football game or whatever, and you got your hike in that weekend. So we're going to move from Eagle Fern Park to Eagle Creek, different Eagle Creek. But first, the Columbia River Gorge is one of the most unique environments in the country because the Columbia River is a massive river that originates in Canada and flows directly through the Cascades. It is the only river that flows through the Cascade Range entirely. And so it's created this enormous gorge, almost 5,000 feet deep. And so it's also very close to home. The view from Angel's Rest, this is Angel's Rest, which is the very west end of the gorge. There's Portland right there, which you're really close to home. But unfortunately, the proximity and the beauty means that many of these hikes are very crowded. And that's just the way it is. And of course, it's because they're beautiful. This is one of the falls above Multnomah Falls, one of my favorite spots in the gorge. And this is Wakulla Falls, lots and lots and lots of waterfalls. And then as you get to the east end of the gorge, you've reached the dry side of the Cascades. And so it is beautiful in the spring, beautiful in the fall, beautiful in the winter, and incredibly hot in the summer. But right now, this part of the gorge is green and overflowing with wildflowers east of Hood River, and I cannot recommend enough going and spending essentially every spring weekend on the east end of the gorge if you can. Because you'll see lots of this, balsam root. And at the very far east end of the gorge is the Deschutes River, where it flows all the way from Central Oregon and empties into the Columbia River, about 13 miles east of the Dalles. And the Deschutes River, I would not recommend going in the summer because it is very hot. But this is where I love to go in the winter because it's a completely different environment from Portland. Here, it's green. Here, it's wet. The Deschutes River, it's dry. It's essentially it's almost desert. The classification is 10 inches of rain a year, and Deschutes gets 11. So it's very desert-like. So it's a very diverse environment. But I'm going to talk to you about my favorite hike in the gorge, and I want to talk to you about Eagle Creek. So Eagle Creek is one of the most famous hikes in Oregon, and Eagle Creek was also the epicenter of, before the 2020 fires, the 2017 Eagle Creek fire was devastating, burned a lot of the gorge, and yet the photos I'm going to show you were taken 2 weeks ago. Everything is recovering wonderfully. You can tell there was a fire, but for the most part, it does not detract from the scene. And everything is just wonderful and back, and everything feels right in the world when you're there. So, I do not recommend this hike for anybody afraid of heights. Let me be clear about that. That is the one thing that I can tell you right now. If you have a fear of heights, this is not a good place for you. Unless you're working on your fear of heights, and that's an excellent place for you. But as you go along, this is about 3 miles back, and this is, you can see there was a fire here. You can see,
it's a touch screen.
It is a touch screen, sorry. You can see the damage. But for the most part, you're looking at the trail, you're looking at the waterfalls. And this is not every square inch of the forest. About half the trail, about half the forest looks like that. The rest of it is mostly unburned. And so you can see here, this is at the spot called High Bridge, which is where there's a bridge way high above Eagle Creek. And this is a great place to stop if you're just out for a fairly easy to moderate hike. It's 6.6 miles out and back to this spot. And the elevation gain is very gradual, and you get to pass a bunch of waterfalls. And most people turn around here. But if you're feeling energetic, I do suggest you go on. Because as you go along, the flowers get better, the waterfalls get taller, and the crowds get thinner. So these are glacier lilies. I think they're glacier lilies. They're glacier lilies, yes, I thought so. Glacier lilies grow profusely along the creek in April, so they're probably about done now. This is 2.5 weeks ago. And the waterfalls get more impressive. This one, there was never a bridge here, so in the spring, you have to actually wade across this creek. I thought it was great, and eventually, after 6+ miles, you reach this incredible spot that is almost unparalleled anywhere else I've ever hiked. And this is a place called Tunnel Falls, which is one of Oregon's most amazing places. It's called Tunnel Falls because, as you see, there's a tunnel behind the falls. The folks who constructed this trail, in their, I don't want to say infinite wisdom, but in their great wisdom, looked at the waterfall and did not see this as an impediment to building the trail. So they took some dynamite and blasted a tunnel behind the falls. So if you look at the falls now, it doesn't seem like there should be a trail there, and yet you know there is. And then you see, right there, there's the tunnel, and there's the trail. Tunnel Falls is 180 feet tall. It's one of the most impressive waterfalls in the gorge. And the trail goes right next to it, behind it, and then around it. And I've been there so many times and I never get tired of it. I could just stare at it all day. But of course, doing so would be difficult because enough people come through and there's not really anywhere to step off the trail. But don't turn around at Tunnel Falls, because there are 2 more waterfalls right past Tunnel Falls. One of them is called Twister Falls, and that one, it's a bit difficult to photograph because it's in a very precarious location right off the trail. But many people don't even make this spot, which is 7 Mile Falls, which is only 200 yards past Twister Falls, and only not about 4/10 of a mile past Tunnel Falls. And this, I'm really glad I started going back here, because once you get here, there's almost no crowds. You have plenty of places to stop and sit and have lunch and enjoy yourself, and truly, you got to see all the waterfalls at Eagle Creek. So if you're coming back here, it ends up being a 13-mile hike, but very gradual. You're going to stop and take lots of pictures. You're going to stop and look at the waterfalls. And one of the great things about the fire, there aren't that many great things about fire, but one of the great things about the fire is that it actually cleared out a lot of it cleared views. There were views of waterfalls that you could never see before. And so there are at least 3 or 4 more waterfalls that were never visible from the trail before the fire that are now front and center, right in your line of sight. So I love this hike. This is one of Oregon's most famous hikes, but it's also one of Oregon's best hikes. And best of all, it's about a 45-minute drive, well, maybe an hour from here, but a 45-minute drive from Portland. So, Eagle Creek is the best. I don't get tired of it. The Northern Oregon Cascades is all about Mount Hood. I love this photo of Mount Hood from Lost Lake on a very moody day at the end of November. But it's all about Mount Hood. Ramona Falls, the famous Ramona Falls on the west side of Mount Hood. Yoakum Ridge above Ramona Falls, one of the most difficult places to access on the mountain, but one of the most rewarding. The verdant forests of the lowlands around Mount Hood on the west side. And the ponderosa pine forests on the east side of the mountain. One of my favorite places. And the mountain lakes. This is Boulder Lake, one of my favorite lakes. So, with all of that in mind, we're going to take a hike that it goes to one of my favorite places on the mountain, and that is Gnarl Ridge on the east side of Mount Hood. So you see here it goes to Elk Meadows, and so we will start there. As you hike up, you get to pass a number of these beauties. These are Cascade lilies, formerly known as Washington lilies, but they do not grow in the state of Washington. It's a misnomer. They were named after Martha Washington. One of the funnier facts. You'll also hear them as Mount Hood lilies, Santiam lilies, Shasta lilies. The Shasta lilies are actually different, etc. But anyway, these are my favorite flowers on earth, and you will pass them, most likely. And you can take a side trip to this neat place called Elk Meadows, which is a large meadow that has a shelter. If you're just up for a fairly moderate hike, this is a great place to stop. Also, see the moon? That's always fun. But if you're going to Gnarl Ridge, it's kind of a longer hike, and you go up through the forest and you won't see Mount Hood, and you'll be wondering, why did I do this? Where's the view? I was promised a view. Usually if you go in the summer, the trail is lined with lupin, and it smells wonderful. But this is one of those hikes where the view you don't get even a trace of a view until you reach it. And when you reach it, your breath will be stolen away, and you'll just want to stop what you're doing and just stare at the mountain. This is Mount Hood from its most glaciated side on the east. This is the Newton-Clark Glacier, which is the largest glacier on Mount Hood, I believe. And as you see this viewpoint, and you stop and look at it, you note the crevasses on the glaciers. Actually, a glacier, it's still a single glacier. But also, if you look closely, you'll note there are waterfalls all over, water melting off of the glacier and dropping down into the valley below. And you can keep going if you want. This is the Timberline Trail is what this is on. The Timberline Trail is the trail that circles Mount Hood. So you have your choice of backpacking trips if you want to. And actually, there are campsites tucked away in here too, but you have to know where to look. You can also scramble up some of these hills for better views, but honestly, most people will be content to just sit at this spot and just stare at the mountain for at least an hour. And I always do. I never really want to turn around when I come here. I'm like, do we have to? Of course you do. So, highly recommended. So it's a longer, more difficult hike. I tried to find hikes of all difficulty levels and have at least a few easy and a few moderate and a few hard, but I don't use difficulty levels. That being said, this is on the more difficult side, but it is worth it for the view. So I cannot say that enough. But the Central Oregon Cascades are the heart of the state and my favorite place. So I included 125 hikes in this book. Well, of the 125, 25, so a full 20%, are in the Central Oregon Cascades. And yet I cut like 15 hikes that I'd researched from the final project. Again, this is part of the region I wrote my book on, 101 Hikes in the Majestic Mount Jefferson Region. But the Three Sisters, there was just so much to see. So you've got Mount Jefferson, and you've got wonderful high mountain lakes with fall foliage. This is Marion Lake in the Mount Jefferson Wilderness. You've got massive waterfalls like Sahaley Falls on the Mackenzie River. You've got fields of bear grass in the mountains around Mount Jefferson. This is Coffin Mountain, which is just west of Mount Jefferson. And you've got the Three Sisters with beautiful mountain lakes, and incredibly cold swimming. There's my friend swimming in the lake. I asked him about it last weekend, and he said, oh, it was cold. But he did it. Everybody has that friend that will swim in anything. That's my friend. And of course, you've got the Three Sisters, one of which you can hike to the summit. So this is near the summit of South Sister, which is one of Oregon's great adventures. You're climbing a volcano. I thought about presenting that, and then I thought, no, I'll do something more accessible. This is a highly worthwhile adventure, but you are climbing a mountain. But the hike I'm going to talk about, if you made me pick the best hike in the state, this would be near the top. I might even select this as number one. Tam McArthur Rim. You're starting at an elevation of 6,500 feet, which is taller than a lot of Oregon mountains. And when you start, you're at this lake, and you're going up to this rim, and it looks like, oh, it doesn't look like it's possible, but actually it's graded very well around the backside. And as you go up, you'll have to go a little slower because you're so far up, you will find yourself catching your breath. It is quite high far above sea level for Oregon standards. But then you get to the top, and the view is truly mind-blowing. I love this photo because you can also see people here, which gives perspective on the sheer scope and size of the area. You can see north, so there's Mount Washington, there's Three Finger Jack, there's Mount Jefferson, there's Mount Hood, and behind the clouds over there is Mount Adams, which is in Washington. This is in the center of the state. Likewise, when you're on Mount Hood at Timberline Lodge, you can see Tam McArthur Rim on clear days. It's very, very noteworthy because it's this huge line on the side of Broken Top and the Three Sisters. And there's a little better picture of the view, and you can see Mount Adams there. These are different pictures from different days. So yeah, the view is truly mind-boggling. And all of this can be accessed after just 5 miles of hiking round trip. But of course, me being me, I have to give you a more random, difficult, obscure option, because that's just how I am. The funniest thing about this is the easy, quote-unquote easy, officially sanctioned part of this hike is on a maintained trail, a very well-maintained trail. And the second part of this hike, for the most part, is on an easy, very well-maintained trail, starting at this sign that says trail not maintained. And yet you see people hiking right past it. I've never understood that, but it's funny. And as you hike along, the terrain becomes almost alien as you hike near Broken Top. Broken Top is very aptly named. It's the remains of a volcano. It was once much more impressive. And it essentially is like the decayed, hollow insides of a volcano. And all the rock here is very volcanic, and this photo is not doctored at all. It is really that red. And the Three Sisters are right here, and you can look south to other mountains. And eventually, you kind of have to figure out where you want to go, but if you're up for an adventure, you can follow, I'll go back here. You can follow trail around this side of the ridge right there, or you can go down the other side. Each way will get you there, and it's not that difficult to find. Down into the spectacular valley below Broken Top, and eventually you'll end up at a place which is called No Name Lake. This has become a very well-known place that people hike because essentially it's a glacial lake. This is a glacier. The water is meltwater from the glacier. It is, if you get there early on in the season, it is turquoise blue. It gets a little greener as the season goes on. It's interesting too because people love this spot, and there's an easier way to get there if you don't mind driving a tank. I tried getting there the easier way when I was researching this book. I got about a half mile down that road and just, nope, turned around and went back the way I liked going. So I'm very happy with my choice. And it is truly a spectacular place, and it is worth the longer hike to get there. And of course, if you took the shorter way, which, if you have the right vehicle, you can do, and permit you can do, it's only like 6 miles round trip, but then you did not get to go to Tam McArthur Rim. But this, you get to go to Tam McArthur Rim and end up here, and then you get to go back to Tam McArthur Rim on the way back. And before you leave, you have to wander up to the top of the ridge above the lake, where you get the same view you got earlier, but then also you're looking down at the lake, and then you're looking down the backside to the other side of this glacier, and more meltwater lakes below that. Truly a magnificent sight. I did this, it was fairly early in the day, because I'm just a morning person. I sat at that spot right there, had a very early lunch. I just sat and marveled at how happy I was and how perfect the day was and how I was very, very, very happy I'd made the choice that I did. So this is another hike. The prow is that viewpoint I pointed out earlier that's the very well-maintained trail to the very obvious viewpoint. And that is, you need a limited entry permit. I'll be glad to get into detail on that at the end of the program if people want. But you need a permit, but otherwise it's a very easy spot to get to, and you can take your time and make sure to wear sunscreen because you are pretty high up. No Name Lake, this is a much longer, more difficult hike, but it is worth it on so many levels. Every time I look at these photos, I'm like, can I go back? Can I go back this summer, please? So I had so many hikes in the Cascades I could have presented in Central Cascades, but this is my favorite. But I want to talk about Southern Oregon, because speaking of favorite places, Crater Lake. I'm going to take a drink of water, if that's okay. Crater Lake, there are no words that can prepare you for it. No matter how many times you see it, it never fails to amaze. Crater Lake, for those of you who don't know, Crater Lake is the remains of a giant volcano that was larger than Mount Hood, larger than any of the Three Sisters, larger than Mount Jefferson. And about 7,700 years ago, I want to say, there was a gigantic eruption that, essentially the mountain collapsed from the inside. The eruption was so huge. And over time, the crater, which is known as a caldera, filled in with water and created the deepest lake in North America. So there is no outlet. The only inlet is rain. And it really is that blue. Also around Crater Lake is this wonderful waterfall called Lenovo Falls, which I really loved. And then Mount Thielsen, the lightning rod of Southern Oregon, one of the coolest places and one of the funnest places to explore. And lots of rare flowers as you get further south into Oregon. This is Siskiyou Louisa, which we saw in one spot near the Oregon-California border. Really, really neat flower that I've never seen anywhere else. So this is full of flower photos. And also, this is Kalmiopsis leachiana, which is an even rarer flower that grows only in the Kalmiopsis wilderness, which was named after the flower, in far southwestern Oregon, in a very remote part of southwest Oregon. This is right on the precipice between the Coast Range and the Cascades. So I include this area from both parts of my book. But this flower only grows in maybe a dozen places on Earth. And I highly recommend going to see it when it's in bloom. It's really neat. It's like a little tiny rhododendron. And one of my favorite places was the Illinois River. But this is quite the adventure, so I won't be presenting that in this presentation. I do want to talk, however, about another hike that I loved, which was Sucker Gap and Swan Mountain. So I made a rule for this book that every hike had to be in the state of Oregon. Every single one. But I cheated slightly for this one because the trailheads in California, the trailheads in Oregon, the destinations in Oregon, but to get there, you have to hike into California for a mile and then back out. This is right on the border. And so this spot is actually in California, this sign is. But then you hike up into the woods and cross across the state line. I had to note the exact spot on my GPS where you cross across the state line, and it was pretty... I enjoy stuff like that. So this spot here is like a quarter mile across the state line back in Oregon. Wonderful, wonderful campsite right here. And then an even better campsite is when you make it down to Sucker Gap. These look like redwoods, but they're actually incense cedars. The tallest and most impressive I've ever seen. This is Sucker Gap, a really lovely meadow with a shelter. There aren't too many of these still intact, and this is a shelter that's left over from the days when trails were longer trails, and these places like this were used for storing horses and for longer camps. But so this was a really beautiful, fun hike, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I got good weather, but it wasn't perfect, and you'll see that in a bit. This is a fairly easy hike to Sucker Gap. The trail is very gradual, lots of neat flowers. But if you really want a great view, you got to wander up to the top of Swan Mountain, which is a little bit further north along the trail. On that, there's no official trail, but there's a user trail right to the top, and it was really cool. And the view, one of the interesting things about this is the view is of California, into far northern California, and all its many mountain ranges. But the clouds started rolling in that day, and so I didn't get to see Mount Shasta, and I didn't get to see Mount McLaughlin in Oregon. But I got to see all the mountains here, and if you look closely to the texture of the mountains here, you can see some of the ranges in California, such as the Marble Mountains and the Trinity Alps. Really, really a cool spot. And also, lots and lots and lots of flowers. This was on the same trip I did Black Hawk Point, so it was mid-June. But these are really beautiful, fun hikes, and this is the beginning of, you're entering into a trail network where you could easily spend days exploring all the side trails. I loved this trip, and I spent a lot of time near the town of Jacksonville along the Applegate River, and that's the easiest way to access this, is in that area. And I found myself, I went back there again and again and again for various reasons, and I never got tired of going to that spot. So that's Southern Oregon, but now we have to go east to the dry side. So the Central Oregon High Desert, I took a very liberal definition of that. To me, it was everything east of the Cascades and west of the Blues, from the Columbia to the California border. It's a very liberal interpretation of what is considered Central Oregon. But that way, essentially the premise of this was the Deschutes and John Day rivers and their basins. So this is the Deschutes River, which is a constant companion in this area. I have a lot of hikes along the Deschutes. Here is the John Day River in Cottonwood Canyon, and there's Wendy yet again. It's a neat spot there. And this is the Deschutes Canyon near Maupin, so that's Mount Hood. This is accessible in a day from Portland, but this starts getting into the realm of probably better to make it a weekend. And then as you go further east, if you look really hard, there's a few places where you can see flowering cactus. Really cool. People wouldn't think that there would be cactus in Oregon, but there are. They're just not that common. And the Painted Hills, always a wonderful place. And Blue Basin, which feels like another planet, which is part of the John Day fossil beds. I went here with some friends, and it had rained the day before, and you can see the water running out of the basin looks like pistachio cream. It's really cool. But so I wanted to talk about one of my favorite shorter hikes in the book, and this is a place called Scout Camp. It's near the town of Terrebonne, and as I said, the Deschutes River is a constant companion. This hike, to access it, you drive to the end of a small gravel road, passing some houses, and you think, where's the canyon? Where's the trail? And you get to the trailhead and you think, well, where's the canyon? And you hike straight through a juniper forest, you get views out to the Cascades, and then you reach the edge of the canyon, and there's the Deschutes 500 feet below you, flowing through this incredibly beautiful canyon of striped colored cliffs. And it's a closer look at the cliffs and the rock formations here. And really, particularly if you come here early in the morning, the color in this photo doesn't do it justice. It looks almost purple. But then you think, how in the world do I get down there? Well, the trail very carefully switchbacks down through the canyon, passing lots of flowers in the spring. Lots of flowers in the spring. I like flowers, obviously. And then eventually you end up at river level. You don't quite get to river level, but you get close. And then you're hiking under all those beautiful cliffs you got to see. And eventually you do have to make your way back out of it. But it's a short hike. This is a 2.2 mile hike, and yet you're going to be stopping every 100 yards or so to take pictures. And I've done this like maybe 10 times, and it's the same thing every time for me. So I would love it if this trail were longer, but it isn't, and unfortunately, that's just the way it is. But every time I come here, I see something new. And this spot right here, as you're hiking back out, this is where White Shoes Creek, which drains off of the Three Sisters and then through the town of Sisters, empties into the Deschutes River. And so there's actually a trail that accesses this spot from the other side. But this was a really, really neat spot. I never noticed this viewpoint before. It's a very easy, very fun loop. There are parts that are very steep, but for the most part, it's pretty easy. And you can find yourself doing this and then going on and doing something else later in the day. I recommend morning better than afternoon. It does get quite hot down in the canyon. But to me, this is like the perfect Central Oregon hike. So we do have to head east now, far to the east, to Northeast Oregon. This encompasses the Elkhorn Range, which is not as well known as the Wallowas, and then Hell's Canyon, the magnificent open terrain of Hell's Canyon, and down into Hell's Canyon, which is, Hell's Canyon, if you don't know, is where it's the boundary between Oregon and Idaho. It's I want to say 8,000 foot deep canyon formed by the Snake River. And also the High Wallowas, which are giant mountain range in Northeast Oregon. More of the Wallowas. More of the Wallowas. I did a lot of hikes in the Wallowas. It is truly that beautiful. And so the hike I want to talk to you about, to me, is the crown jewel of the Wallowas, and maybe the most famous hike in the Wallowas, but also my favorite. It's my favorite for a number of reasons, but among them, the first time I went to the Wallowas, I was 12. My stepdad and I, he loved to hike. He still does, but he doesn't do it much anymore. And we looked at the map and thought, well, Ice Lake, that sounds cool. So it's like, how long is it? And we looked at the sign, the trail, and it said 8 to Ice Lake. Oh, great, an 8-mile round trip hike. I don't think it dawned on us that was 8 one way. This is a long, long hike. You can do it in a day. Overnight is probably better, but you can do it in a day. But we made it. We made it to the lake, and we were very tired afterwards. As we got back to the car, we opened up the truck, opened up the cooler, and I drank an entire 2-liter bottle of Dr. Pepper, because that's how I was when I was 12. And then we went and made steaks at a campground and went to bed at like 7:30. But I've come back to this hike over and over and over again, every 5 to 7 years. And so these photos were taken in September 2020, during that week when smoke just shut down everything. We went backpacking here after 2 previous vacation plans were smoked out and canceled due to the pandemic. And it was very smoky here, but we managed to catch 1 morning of blue sky. I think this was the only place in the entire state with blue sky. And we got to see lots of these beautiful flowers known as gentians, which are one of the last flowers in the summer. They open up in the sunshine and close when it's shady. They typically grow late August into September, like one of the very last flowers in the wildflower season. And lots of waterfalls on the way up to Ice Lake that still flow quite well even in September. And this is from a different trip, but this is the base of one of the waterfalls. Ice Falls below Ice Lake is the tallest waterfall in eastern Oregon, with an estimated height of somewhere between 500 and 600 feet. And this is the base of it. And eventually you get to the lake, and these are the 2 tallest mountains in eastern Oregon. You've got Sacagawea and the Matterhorn, the 2 tallest mountains in eastern Oregon, and this gigantic lake at the base of them. So I mentioned swimming. The shelf next to the lake goes straight down. The lake has a depth of about 180 feet, I want to say. It's very deep. And the name is no misnomer, it's cold. But if you're backpacking, there are a lot of campsites tucked all the way around the lake in every little nook and cranny. Lots of places are quite private, some places aren't. We got lucky and got a really nice site near the lake that was well established. But this is a spot that you can combine it with other larger backpacking trips. You can do a 1-nighter, you can do a 2-nighter, you can do a 3-nighter, or you can just go for a day. We did a 2-night backpack the time we did it. Every other time I've done it as a day hike. It's a wonderful day hike. I strongly recommend it. It's my favorite hike in eastern Oregon, and I think it's the most beautiful hike in eastern Oregon, at least northeastern Oregon. So as I said, though, it is a long day or a long weekend, but it is worth it. Also cool, no pass, no permit needed. And that's better and better and better these days. It's nice to find places where you don't need to plan in advance. You can just show up. But we've got one more region left, and that's Southeast Oregon. This was terra incognita, terra incognita. When I worked on this book, I'd only been to Steens Mountain once, and I'd never been anywhere else. So all of Southeast Oregon was basically new to me. And I discovered Hart Mountain Antelope Refuge. And I discovered the Malheur River. Really, really beautiful place. And I discovered the west side of Steens. This is Little Blitzen Gorge. And the top of Steens This was the last hike I did for this book, which was Wild Horse Lake, near the top of Steens Mountain. I knew I had to get there, and so the day I went, the day I planned to go, I got snowed out. It was snowing at the top of the mountain when I went, so I had to drive back to Burns, and I went back the next day. I was persistent. But you also get to the Owyhee Canyon lands. Yes, this is in Oregon. It looks like Utah or Mars, but it's in Oregon. This is a place I cannot wait to go back to. But I want to talk to you about my favorite hike in Southeast Oregon, and that's Pike Creek, which I did almost exactly 1 year ago today. It was, I want to say, like May 22nd or something like that. It's a great hike in May because you've got the top of Steens Mountain. It's still snowy, but the hike is easily accessible. And so Pike Creek is this canyon right here. So you're going to hike along this road and into this canyon, and around you are red cliffs, but if you go there in the spring, they're green, with striped with green foliage and lots of lupin. And as you get deeper into the canyon, one section of the trail is lined with yellow lupin, which does not grow everywhere. It's quite uncommon. You'll find it in Eastern Oregon in some places, but it's not very common. Lupin is a very common flower all over. Yellow lupin, not so much. So here's a close-up of the yellow lupin. Really cool. It smells amazing too. And of course you are essentially in the desert, so lots of lizards. I also saw a rattlesnake on this trail, but it was a hot day. And eventually, as you get deeper and deeper into the canyon, you can look back out to the east. This is the Alvord Desert, which is the driest place in Oregon. It is so dry, it is dry because Steens Mountain is a giant fault block mountain that's been uplifted by all the natural processes that do that. And so when storms come to the west and hit Steens Mountain gets a decent amount of precipitation, but everything directly to the east is very dry. And so the Alvord Desert is essentially what's called playa. It's just like a salt flat, basically. I loved this hike. There was so much to see, and I could have used 50 photos, but that would cause the programs to crash. But the closest town is Fields, which was quite a trip. Fields is a town of about 20 that's known for its gas station and restaurant that makes milkshakes like this large. But this is a wonderful hike that is not that difficult, and truly, I could not say enough good things about this hike, even if I tried. So that's the whole state of Oregon, and I want to talk before we go, just for those of you who are not those of you in the know and those of you who are. So the important things before you set out into extraordinary Oregon: a functional car. Cannot stress this enough. I have so many stories that I will not get into, but make sure your car is in perfect working order before you leave. You'll be a lot happier if you do. Good rain gear, because this is Oregon, although more than half of Oregon is either high desert or arid. But good rain gear is essential regardless of where you're going. The 10 essentials, we talked about that plenty. A sense of adventure. Be willing to take that side trail that I didn't mention. Be willing to scramble up that knoll I didn't mention. Be willing to drive down that side road and see what view is there. That's how I live, and I am very happy about that. Do not rely on your phone to bail you out of an emergency. I cannot stress this enough. You might get cell reception on 1/3 of the hikes in this book, at most. So your phone essentially doesn't work if you don't have reception. I use what's called I have a satellite communicator. I don't recommend that for everyone. Not everybody needs that, but if you're planning on spending a lot of time outdoors, I highly recommend it. It comes with an SOS button, and I can text my wife when I'm out hiking by myself. From anywhere in the state, no matter where I am, I can text anybody I want to, but especially my wife. And more than anything else, always let someone know where you are going and when you will return. Most of those people on the news you see took off for that afternoon hike in that place and they didn't tell anyone, and then they took a wrong turn or fell off the trail, and then nobody heard from them for 5 days. And hopefully they were rescued, but some of them aren't. All of those bad stories in the news, almost all of them involve somebody not following one of these rules. So Last but not least, remember to have fun. Hiking is fun. You get to hang out. If you like solo hiking, you get some great me time. If you like to get to hike with your friends, it's a great time with your friends. You get exercise. You get to see some beautiful places. You get to eat lots of heavy, fatty, delicious food afterwards because you've spurned a bunch of calories. It's great. So hiking is immensely fun. And I love to share it with you, and this state is incredible. So, you have any questions? Cheryl, are they able to ask questions through YouTube stream? Okay, I didn't think so.
What camera do you use to take your pictures?
That's an excellent question. I was using a Canon T3 for a while, but then it died after being rained on about 10 million times. And so I switched to a Sony a6000, it's a DSLR, which means it's a digital camera that has a detachable lens. But the body is very small. It's like this, very small. It's almost like the size of a large phone. And then it has a detachable lens, so I can get lenses to put on there. I love that I can take high quality photos that are high resolution. I can take video, I can do panoramas, but it fits very easily into my gear. It doesn't feel like I'm weighed down at any point.
It takes great photos.
Thank you. I'm very, very happy with that camera. And it was not that expensive as far as digital cameras go. The panorama feature is really awesome too. So. Thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure to do a presentation. I love it.